Hi guys, today we're talking about chapter 22, which is all about Darwin's findings and how we got descent with modification, which is what Darwin called evolution. There are endless forms of species on this earth, and that began with an understanding in 1859 when Darwin published The Origin of Species. This focused biologists' attention away from the earth is small and not very old to the diversity that organisms really did exhibit. He noted that current species are descendants of those from ancestral species. Evolution can be defined by Darwin's term, descent with modification, and it's viewed as both a pattern and a process. Darwinian's revolution challenged the traditional views of a young Earth with unchanging species. Back in the 1800s, people were highly religious, and a lot of them didn't actually believe in the fact that evolution was real because there wasn't a lot of proof of it. So Darwin's ideas had deep historical roots. Darwin was influenced by a series of scientists. So he was born here in 1809, but he was influenced by Hutton, who proposes the principle of gradualism. Thomas Malthus, he was kind of influenced behind Lamarck. He was very strongly influenced by Lamarck. Cuvier, Lyell. And then in 1831, Darwin aborted the HMS Beagle, which traveled around the world where he was a naturalist on board. And then 20 years later, he published the first copy of The Origin of Species. The Greek philosopher Aristotle viewed species as fixed and arranged them on some type of an evolutionary tree, or a tree of life. This held true to the Old Testament that says that species were individually created by God and therefore they were perfect and unchanging. However, we had Carlos Linnaeus, who interpreted the organism adaptations as evidence that the creator had designed each species for a specific purpose. Linnaeus created and founded taxonomy, which is the branch of biology that classifies organisms, giving them a two-part scientific name in Latin. We call this binomial nomenclature, two-named naming system. And this format gives a genus and species name for every organism. An example of that is Homo sapien, which is the scientific name for humans, which is loosely translated from Latin to wise being. There were evidence of change happening over time. Darwin really studied fossils. We now call this paleontology, that helped lay the groundwork for Darwin's ideas. Fossils are remains or traces of organisms that existed in the past, usually found in sedimentary rock, which appear in layers or strata. Here, we have those strata. The deeper the strata, the older the specimen inside of it are, and the older that rock is. Paleontology is the study of fossils that was largely developed by French scientist Georges Cuvier. He advocated for the theory of catastrophism. This speculated that each boundary between the strata represents some type of catastrophic event on Earth. Major weather events, the movement of tectonic plates, that is all considered catastrophic events. Then we had scientist and geologist James Hutton and Charles Lyell, who perceived that the changes in Earth's surface can be result from slow and continuous actions that are still operating today. We now understand this as tectonic plate movement, but back in the 1800s, they weren't very sure on what it was. Lyell's principle of uniformitarianism states that mechanisms of change are consistent over time. And this and the theory of the fossils in the strata and catastrophism influenced Darwin's thinking. We had a scientist by the name of Lamarck who hypothesized that species evolved through the use and disuse of body parts. However, this very quickly was denied because there was no evidence that could support that, okay, I'm no longer using my left foot, so I'm not going to have a left foot anymore. That's not exactly how it happens. Darwin's descent with modification happens through natural selection, and that explains the adaptations of organisms in the unity of life. There was some doubt about the permanence of species that was perceived in Darwin's ideas. As a boy and into his adulthood, Charles Darwin, who went by the name of Chuck, had a consuming interest in nature. He first studied medicine at Cambridge University, the same university that 100 years later we discovered the structure of DNA. And he was unsuccessful at medicine, so then he studied theology. After graduating, he took an unpaid position as a naturalist and a companion to Captain Robert Fitzroy for a 5-year journey around the world aboard the Beagle. On his journeys, he collected samples, rock, soil, organisms, everywhere he went, and what he found was astounding. The most populous place that he spent time was just off of the coast of South America on a small island chain called the Galapagos Islands. Here he observed that fossils resembled living species from the same region, and living species resembled other species from nearby regions. While he was in Chile, he experienced an earthquake and observed the uplift of rocks over time. This was a catastrophic event that helped him kind of solidify his findings on catastrophism. He was influenced by Lyell's principles of geology and thought that the Earth had to have been more than 6,000 years old. His interest in the geographic isolation and distribution of species around the world was kindled by the stop at the Galapagos Islands off the west coast of South America. Here, he hypothesized that species from South America had colonized the Galapagos Islands and then speciated into new species on those islands. This is the map, so to speak, of where Darwin traveled. So started up in Great Britain, they bounced around North America or South America, stopped in Chile, and just off the coast of Chile is the Galapagos Islands, down to Australia, and then back to South America and up. His research and assessing in his observations upon his return, he perceived that adaptations to an environment and the organism of new species were two closely related processes. What he said is that an organism had to have become adapted to its environment. One of the things that Darwin noticed was finches. And he noticed that on one island, there were cactus eaters. They had these medium-sized, thick beaks. Then on the other island, he noticed insect eaters that had very small beaks, and seed eaters that had very thick beaks. But if you look at them, they all look like they could be the same breed of bird. The only difference was their beak, and these are adaptations based off of their environment. In 1844, Darwin wrote an essay on natural selection as a mechanism for descent with modification, but he did not publicly introduce his theory. Natural selection is a process in which individuals with favorable inherited characteristics are more likely to survive and reproduce because they have traits that are more desirable for that environment. In 1858, Darwin received a manuscript from Alfred Russel Wallace, who developed a theory of natural selection that was similar to Darwin's. So Darwin finished The Origin of Species and published it the very next year. There are 3 observations to Darwin's Origin of Species. The first is that the unity of life. The second is the diversity of life. And the third is the match between the organism and their environment. Darwin never used the term evolution in the first edition of The Origin of Species. He always used the term descent with modification. This summarized his perception on the unity of life, and he did this because he knew the negative connotation around the word evolution. The phrase refers to the view that organisms are related through descent from an ancestor that lived in a remote past. In Darwin's view, the history of life is like a tree with branches that represent the diversity of life. And this theory meshed with the hierarchy created by Linnaeus. And this is what he used. This is another way of now looking at a modern evolutionary tree where each branch point is the descent with modification from an ancestor. He also noted that humans have the ability to modify other species by selecting and breeding individuals with the desired traits in a process that he called artificial selection. He drew two inferences from his two observations. And one way that he saw this was in wild mustard. Depending on what you selected for, it gave you kale, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, broccoli, or kohlrabi. His first observation was that members of a population often vary in their inherited characteristics. No two ladybugs ever look the same. His second observation was that all species can produce more offspring than the environment can support, and many of these offspring fail to survive. Something like a spore cloud of pollen. His first inference was that individuals whose heritable traits make them a higher probability of surviving and reproducing in a given environment tend to lead to more offspring than other individuals. And his second inference was the inequality, there was an unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce that leads to the accumulation of favorable traits within the environment over time. This was influenced by Thomas Malthus, who noted the potential for the human population to increase faster than the food supply and other resources can. If some favorable traits are advantages, these will accumulate in a population over time and increase the frequency of those individuals with those traits. This explains the match between organisms being best fit for their environment.